March 1584. Inside the Kremlin, an old man lowers himself onto a low wooden stool and calls for his chessboard. His hands, the same hands that once signed decrees that emptied entire cities, now shake as he sets the pieces in place. For weeks, a comet with a long, blood-colored tail has hung over Moscow's skyline, and the court's own soothsayers have already named the exact day he will die. Today is that day. Within the hour, the most feared ruler in Russian history will be gone. The official story is simple: a sudden collapse, a weak heart, an old man's death after decades on the throne. But almost before his body is cold, that simple story starts to fall apart. Witnesses whisper that within hours his body swelled and changed color in a way that looked less like natural illness and more like poison. Foreign ambassadors write the word murder home in their private letters. Nearly 400 years later, Soviet scientists would finally break open his tomb inside the Kremlin walls and run real forensic science on his bones, hoping to settle it once and for all. What they found only made the case stranger. This is the story of Ivan IV of Russia, the boy who survived a childhood of betrayal to become his country's first Tsar, the ruler who built an empire and then turned on his own people to keep it, and the sudden disputed death that historians are still arguing about today. This is Clue Series. A Boy King in a Court of Wolves. To understand how Ivan died, you first have to understand what almost broke him before he ever ruled a single day. He was born in 1530 in a village outside Moscow, the long-awaited son of the Grand Prince of Moscow, and for 3 years he lived the sheltered life of an heir apparent. Then his father died, and everything changed. His mother, Elena, took the throne as regent for her 3-year-old son, and for a few years she ruled with real skill, reforming the currency and holding rival noble families in check through sheer force of will. Then, when Ivan was only 8 years old, she died suddenly. And almost immediately, the whispers began that she too had been poisoned by the same nobles she'd spent years suppressing. Whether or not that rumor was true, it left the young prince completely exposed, with no parent left to protect his throne. 2 rival boyar families, the Shuiskis and the Belskis, tore the court apart, fighting to control the boy who technically outranked them both, but had no power to stop either side. Chroniclers describe a childhood almost impossible to imagine. A crowned prince deliberately neglected, sometimes underfed, dressed in worn-out hand-me-down clothes, while the men supposedly serving him looted the royal treasury in his name. He watched, powerless, as his mother's closest allies were dragged out of the palace and killed, sometimes in rooms he could not avoid walking through. He later wrote that he and his younger brother were treated like the lowest menials, ignored and humiliated by the same nobles who bowed low to him during formal ceremonies. Historians studying Ivan's later reign keep circling back to this same decade of his childhood. A child who is taught over and over that the people closest to power are the people most likely to betray or even kill you, does not usually grow into a trusting, secure adult. By the time Ivan turned 13, something in him had already hardened into something colder. He struck back at the Shuisky family with a sudden, ruthless purge of his own, ordering the arrest and execution of one of the very boyars who had humiliated him, a shockingly early demonstration that the frightened boy king had learned exactly how the game around him was played. 3 years later, at just 16 years old, he made a decision no Russian ruler had ever made before him. He would not simply be crowned Grand Prince, the old title his ancestors had used for centuries. He would be crowned Tsar, a word carrying the full historical weight of Caesar, formally declaring Moscow the successor to Rome and Byzantium, and himself the absolute divinely sanctioned ruler of a new kind of state. The making of a Tsar. Ivan's coronation in January of 1547 was, by every surviving account, magnificent. Golden robes, ancient regalia passed down for generations, the full ceremonial weight of the Orthodox Church behind him. But real stability came a few weeks later from an unlikely place: his marriage. Out of more than 1,000 noble candidates paraded before him in a formal empire-wide bride show, Ivan chose Anastasia Romanovna, a young woman from a respected but not especially powerful family. It would turn out to be the most consequential personal decision of his early reign. By most contemporary accounts, the marriage was a genuinely happy one, and Anastasia's calm, steadying influence is repeatedly credited by court writers with keeping the young Tsar's famous temper in check during these years. That same year, a catastrophic fire tore through Moscow, destroying huge sections of the wooden capital and killing thousands of residents in a single terrifying night. In the chaos and grief that followed, a mob, convinced that sorcery and the Tsar's own maternal relatives were somehow to blame for the disaster, stormed the Kremlin itself, and Ivan, only 17 years old at the time, had to personally face down a genuine popular uprising at his own palace gates. It was a brutal, formative introduction to how quickly a ruler's authority could unravel without warning. In the aftermath, Ivan surrounded himself with a small circle of reform-minded advisors that historians now call the Chosen Council. And for over a decade, this period became the most genuinely productive stretch of his entire reign. He issued a sweeping new law code, the Sudebnik of 1550, standardizing justice and taxation across a sprawling, disorganized realm for the first time. He convened Russia's first national representative assembly, the Zemsky Sobor, giving the nobility and clergy a formal voice in matters of state. He created the Streltsy, Russia's first permanent standing infantry force, replacing an unreliable patchwork of noble levies who owed loyalty to their own lords first. He even brought the first printing press into the country, a small but telling signal of a ruler who genuinely saw himself as modernizing a nation, not simply conquering one. For a while, it looked as though the traumatized boy from the Regency years had transformed into exactly the kind of Tsar Russia needed: capable, reform-minded, and married to a woman who seemed to bring out his better instincts at every turn. It would not last nearly as long as anyone hoped. Empire and ambition. While his internal reforms took hold at home, Ivan turned his attention outward, and here too, the early results were spectacular. For centuries, the Khanate of Kazan, a powerful Muslim successor state to the old Mongol Empire, had raided Russian territory freely and controlled the Middle Volga River, one of the single most important trade arteries in the entire region. In 1552, after two earlier failed campaigns, Ivan personally led a massive siege that finally broke through Kazan's walls after weeks of fighting. It was a defining, career-making victory, one that Ivan commemorated by commissioning an entirely new cathedral on Moscow's Red Square, the building we know today around the world as St. Basil's, with its unmistakable swirl of brightly colored domes. 4 years later, Russian forces captured the Khanate of Astrakhan as well, giving Moscow full, uncontested control of the Volga River from its northern headwaters all the way down to the Caspian Sea. Almost overnight, Muscovy stopped being a regional principality squeezed by stronger neighbors and became something closer to a genuine empire, with new Muslim and Turkic populations now living under Christian Russian rule. Riding this momentum, Ivan looked west next, toward the Baltic Sea. Russia had no reliable warm water port for European trade, and in 1558, Ivan launched an ambitious campaign against the weakening Livonian order, hoping to seize a valuable stretch of Baltic coastline and finally open Russia to wider European commerce. At first, The campaign went well, and old fortresses fell quickly to advancing Russian forces. But success created an unexpected new problem. As the collapsing Livonian territories fell apart, they didn't simply pass to Russia. Poland, Lithuania, Sweden, and Denmark all rushed in to claim pieces for themselves, transforming what Ivan had expected to be a quick, decisive regional war into a grinding, decades-long conflict against nearly every major power in Northern Europe at once. The war Ivan hoped would crown his reign with a Baltic Empire would instead drag on for 25 brutal years, slowly bleeding his treasury and his army dry, and quietly setting the stage for everything darker that came next. The turn. In 1560, everything changed again, and this time there would be no recovery. Anastasia, Ivan's wife of 13 years, fell suddenly and severely ill, and within months, she was dead. Ivan's grief was described by those closest to him as almost unrecognizable in its intensity, and it curdled quickly into open, furious suspicion. He became convinced, immediately and completely, that his beloved wife had been deliberately poisoned by boyars who resented her family's rising influence at court. Centuries later, in the year 2000, forensic scientists actually exhumed and chemically tested Anastasia's remains, and remarkably, they found abnormally high concentrations of both mercury and arsenic preserved in her hair and bones, a combination that many researchers consider genuinely strong physical evidence that Ivan may have been right all along. If that reading is correct, it means the Tsar's paranoia about being surrounded by poisoners wasn't simply the product of a damaged mind. At least once, in this one specific case, it may have actually happened exactly as he feared. But in 1560, Ivan had no forensic laboratory to consult, only raw grief and mounting suspicion, and both curdled into rage with nowhere else to go. He turned first on his own closest advisors, the very men who had guided the productive reforms of the chosen council, accusing them of failing to protect Anastasia and of secretly working against him all along, behind a mask of loyal service. Both men were swiftly exiled from court. One reportedly died in disgrace, far from Moscow and everything he had helped build. From this point forward, contemporary accounts describe a czar who trusted almost no one left around him, who saw conspiracies waiting in every corner of his own court, and who increasingly chose to rule through raw fear rather than the reform-minded partnership that had defined his earlier years on the throne. The change reached its breaking point in December of 1565. Ivan abruptly announced he was abdicating the throne entirely and left Moscow, only to send back a carefully worded message. He would return, but only if granted total, unquestioned authority, complete with a private domain and private armed forces answerable to absolutely no one but himself. Facing the terrifying alternative of a czarless Russia in the middle of an unresolved foreign war, the boyars and clergy reluctantly agreed to nearly all of it. It was a masterstroke of political theater, and it handed Ivan the single tool he would use to terrorize his own nobility for the next 7 years of his reign. Reign of Terror. The private domain Ivan carved out for himself was called the oprichnina, and the men who enforced it, the oprichniki, became one of the most feared institutions in all of Russian history. Dressed in black, riding black horses, and reportedly carrying grim symbols of a dog's severed head and a broom lashed to their saddles, meant to show they would sniff out treason and then sweep it away entirely. The oprichniki answered to Ivan alone, operating almost completely outside any normal court procedure or law. Their targets were the very boyar families Ivan had learned to distrust since his own traumatic childhood decades earlier. Estates were seized without warning or formal charge. Entire noble households were forced into monasteries, permanently stripped of their titles and property. or executed on accusations that were rarely, if ever, tested in anything resembling a real trial. Historians describe these years as a genuine, sustained reign of terror, where mere suspicion, a rumor, a resentful neighbor's whispered report, sometimes seemingly nothing at all, could be enough to destroy a family that had loyally served the Russian state for generations before. The single darkest chapter came in 1570, when Ivan became convinced, almost certainly wrongly, that the prosperous northern city of Novgorod was secretly plotting to defect to the Polish-Lithuanian crown. He marched the Oprichniki north and unleashed weeks of violent reprisal against the city and its people. Historians' estimates of the human toll vary considerably, but most place the number of dead somewhere in the low thousands, drawn from a population that had already been Russia's proud second city for centuries. Novgorod's trade networks and regional influence never fully recovered from what happened that winter. We're not going to walk through the specific details of what took place inside those city walls. The historical record is grim enough on its own without dwelling further on it here. But the sheer scale alone tells you exactly what the Oprichnina had become by that point. A machine built for destroying anyone Ivan decided was his enemy, with almost no one left anywhere in Russia powerful enough or brave enough to stand in his way. The countryside itself paid a quiet, lasting price, too, as terrified peasants fled devastated estates, prompting new restrictive decrees that would eventually help harden the institution of Russian serfdom for generations to come. By 1572, even Ivan himself seemed to recognize the Oprichnina had spiraled dangerously out of control, and he formally disbanded it, though the deep culture of fear it had created never fully disappeared from his court again. Blood in the family. If there was one relationship that might have anchored Ivan through all of this turmoil, it should have been his relationship with his eldest surviving son and heir, also named Ivan Ivanovich. By most surviving accounts, the younger Ivan was intelligent, capable, and deeply involved in the actual affairs of state from a young age. He's even credited as a co-author on religious and historical texts commissioned during his father's reign. As the disastrous, decades-long Livonian War dragged into its third decade with no end in sight, the crown prince reportedly grew openly frustrated with his father's continuing military failures, at one point formally requesting permission to personally lead troops to relieve a besieged Russian city on the front lines. Ivan flatly refused him, and by multiple contemporary accounts, a bitter, lasting argument followed between father and son. In November of 1581, that long-simmering family tension finally erupted. The precise trigger is still debated by historians today. Some sources point to a heated dispute involving the prince's pregnant wife and the modest clothing she happened to be wearing when Ivan unexpectedly entered the room. A small domestic disagreement that spiraled instantly and tragically out of control. What almost every mainstream historical account agrees on is the outcome. In a sudden, violent fit of rage, the aging Tsar struck his own son, and the injury proved fatal several days later. His daughter-in-law, present in the same terrible moment, miscarried the child who would have been Ivan's grandson, and a much-needed second potential heir to the throne. It's worth pausing on how strange and genuinely painful this moment remains, even across nearly 4.5 centuries of distance. Foreign ambassadors stationed in Moscow at the time reported that Ivan was consumed by visible, public grief and guilt in the days that followed, reportedly wandering the corridors of the Kremlin at night and refusing to sleep in his usual bedchamber. He personally commissioned prayers for his son's soul at monasteries scattered across Russia and, according to several sources, briefly considered giving up the throne altogether to become a monk himself. The Russian court had lost its most capable, promising young heir in a single afternoon, and a father who had already survived every conceivable kind of political betrayal now had to live with the knowledge that, this time, there was no boyar conspiracy left for him to blame. This one devastating afternoon reshaped everything that came after it, including who would eventually inherit the very throne Ivan was about to leave behind. A body breaking down. In the 2.5 years between his son's death and his own, witnesses at court describe a man who seemed to be physically disintegrating in real time. Ivan had never been a small or fragile figure in his youth. Skeletal analysis conducted centuries later confirmed he was actually a tall, athletically built man well into adulthood. But by his early 50s, foreign visitors to the Russian court described someone who looked decades older than his actual age. Prematurely white hair hanging loose, a swollen and visibly misshapen body, and skin that reportedly gave off a noticeably unpleasant odor, even to those used to court life. He increasingly had to be carried from room to room on a covered litter, no longer able to walk on his own for any real distance. What was actually happening inside his body has become one of the enduring medical mysteries historians still argue over today. Court records describe a Tsar living in near constant, severe physical pain, consistent with a serious degenerative spinal condition that may have gradually caused his own vertebrae to fuse together over time. A genuinely agonizing process that would help explain both his sudden loss of mobility and his increasingly explosive irritability, since chronic, unrelenting pain is well documented, even in modern medicine, to seriously affect mood and temper. For that pain, and for other suspected ailments, Renaissance-era physicians of the period relied heavily on one particular treatment above almost all others: mercury. Mercury-based ointments and oral tonics were standard, respected medical practice across both Europe and Russia during this era, prescribed for everything from stubborn joint pain to skin conditions to suspected venereal disease. Decades before anyone in medicine understood that mercury itself was a slow, cumulative poison that built up steadily in the body. Foreign physicians, including English and German doctors, specifically recruited and brought to Moscow for the Tsar's personal care, appear repeatedly in the surviving court records of these final years, treating a patient whose underlying condition never seemed to meaningfully improve for very long. It's a genuinely tragic medical picture when you step back and look at it as a whole. A powerful ruler in devastating physical pain, treated faithfully for years with a substance that may itself have been steadily damaging his mind and vital organs, all while he continued trying to rule one of the largest and most volatile states anywhere in Europe. By the winter of 1584, those closest to him could sense that something was building toward a head. They simply had no way of knowing exactly what or precisely when. The final days. In the early months of 1584, Moscow's night sky delivered what many people at the time took as an unmistakable, terrifying omen. A great comet appeared, its tail stretching visibly across the winter darkness for weeks on end. Likely by modern astronomical reconstruction, the appearance of a bright long-period comet, though it predates Halley's own next scheduled return by several years. Ivan, who took astrology extremely seriously throughout his entire life, reportedly stared up at it from a palace window one evening and told those standing nearby that a comet exactly like that one was a well-known sign of an approaching ruler's death. According to several later court chronicles, sources historians treat with appropriate caution, since many were compiled or embellished after the fact, Ivan summoned a group of wise women to the palace, some reportedly brought from as far away as the northern region of Lapland, long known in regional folklore for prophecy and second sight, and demanded to know precisely when he would die. Their answer, as later chroniclers recorded it, was chillingly specific: the 18th of March. Ivan is said to have threatened them with execution if that date passed and he was found still alive. Their reported reply has survived in Russian folklore and popular retellings ever since. The day is not over yet. On the morning of March the 18th, 1584 itself, by most contemporary accounts, Ivan actually seemed to be having a reasonably good day for once. He reportedly took a long, relaxing bath, felt strong enough afterward to sit upright unassisted, and called for his chessboard, planning to play a casual game with one of his few remaining trusted courtiers, a boyar named Bogdan Belsky. As he began carefully arranging the pieces on the board with his own hands, Ivan suddenly collapsed where he sat. Attendants rushed frantically to his side. A monk was hurriedly summoned to perform last rites at his bedside. Within a short time, surviving accounts vary from just minutes to a few hours. The Tsar, who had ruled Russia for 37 years, longer than any single ruler before him in its history, was dead. He was 53 years old. Whether the wise women's prophecy was genuine folk prediction, a fortunate guess, or simply a story tidied up afterward to fit the outcome everyone already knew, the eerie coincidence has fueled speculation for centuries since. But the far more serious questions were only just beginning to surface. The investigation begins. Almost immediately, unsettling details began circulating around the Tsar's sudden death. Exactly the kind of details that, fairly or not, tend to fuel a poisoning theory even centuries later. Multiple accounts from the period describe Ivan's body swelling dramatically and beginning to decompose at an unusually rapid pace, to the point that some sources claim the smell inside the Kremlin's private chambers became genuinely difficult to bear within just a day or two of his death. To observers at the time, with no modern understanding of how illness, decomposition, or basic body chemistry actually work, rapid and dramatic bodily changes after death were widely read as a classic, telltale warning sign of poison. And there was certainly no shortage of people around Ivan who might plausibly have wanted him gone for good. After decades of purges, exiled nobility, and a court where loyalty had been enforced through raw terror rather than genuine trust, it would hardly have been shocking if someone standing close to the Tsar had finally decided they'd had enough of him. The political landscape immediately following his death only deepened the surrounding suspicion further. Ivan's surviving heir, his gentle son Fyodor, was widely regarded, even by contemporaries writing about him generously, as pious, deeply religious, and simply not built for the crushing demands of ruling a vast, unstable empire on his own. Real practical power quickly consolidated instead around Fyodor's ambitious brother-in-law, a capable and shrewd boyar named Boris Godunov, who had spent years quietly and carefully positioning himself close to the throne. Within just a few years, Godunov was effectively ruling Russia in every meaningful way except formal title, and after Fyodor's own death in 1598 without an heir, Godunov would go on to become Tsar in his own right at last. It's exactly the kind of outcome that historical poisoning theories tend to love: a powerful, capable figure conveniently positioned right beside the throne at the precise moment the previous ruler dies unexpectedly. Foreign diplomats stationed in Moscow at the time noted these swirling rumors directly in their own private dispatches home, reporting that open talk of murder was circulating through the capital, running right alongside the official court explanation of a sudden, natural collapse. For nearly 400 years afterward, that's exactly where the case stood. Competing rumors on every side, no hard physical evidence either way, and a sealed royal tomb inside the Kremlin that literally no one alive had any real way to examine. Digging up the Tsar. That finally changed in 1963. Soviet authorities authorized a remarkable, and at the time, genuinely unprecedented, scientific project, opening the royal tombs inside the Kremlin's Archangel Cathedral, including the resting places of Ivan and two of his own sons, for full modern forensic examination. Leading the investigation was Mikhail Gerasimov, a pioneering Soviet forensic anthropologist, famous worldwide for a groundbreaking technique that let him reconstruct a person's likely facial appearance directly from the shape of their skull. For the first time in nearly 4 centuries, researchers, and eventually the general public, could finally see a scientifically reconstructed face of Ivan IV based purely on his actual underlying bone structure, rather than centuries of stylized painted portraits and popular imagination. But the far more consequential findings came from careful toxicology testing. Laboratory analysis of Ivan's preserved remains found mercury concentrations dramatically, unmistakably higher than would ever occur naturally in a healthy human body. Strong physical confirmation of exactly the kind of long-term, sustained mercury exposure that court records had already strongly suggested, entirely consistent with years of mercury-based medical treatment for chronic, unrelenting pain. Crucially, though, that same analysis found that arsenic and lead levels in Ivan's own remains fell within a broadly normal range for the period. Not at all the dramatic, sudden spike you would expect to find from a single, deliberate, fatal poisoning attempt. That particular result matters enormously because arsenic was historically one of the single most common deliberate poisons used across Europe, precisely because it was relatively easy to obtain and to secretly administer without immediate detection. Its notable absence in elevated form here is one of the strongest individual pieces of physical evidence against the popular theory of one sudden, fatal poisoning attempt. The skeletal examination told its own quietly compelling story, too. Researchers carefully documented significant abnormal bone growth running along Ivan's spine, a condition entirely consistent with a severe degenerative disease that would have caused exactly the kind of chronic, steadily worsening pain and immobility that Renaissance-era witnesses had already described in their own written accounts. Interestingly, the ongoing debate over whether Ivan's bones show clear evidence of syphilis has never been fully settled by researchers even now. Some analyses conducted over the decades have pointed to changes consistent with the disease, while more recent, cautious reviews of that same physical evidence note that very similar bone changes can also result from other, entirely unrelated chronic conditions. What's not seriously in dispute, however, is the sharp contrast with Anastasia's own 2000 exhumation results, which did show clearly elevated arsenic sitting right alongside the mercury, meaning the physical, scientific case for foul play looks considerably stronger for Ivan's wife than it ultimately does for Ivan himself. Verdict: poison, disease, or both. So, after 4 centuries of persistent rumor and 6 decades of careful forensic science, what's the most honest, evidence-based answer to how Ivan the Terrible actually died? The physical evidence, taken as a whole, points most strongly toward a natural, if genuinely tragic, medical collapse, rather than any single, deliberate poisoning attempt. The clear absence of an arsenic spike is a genuinely hard thing to get around if you're trying to build a classic poisoning case. If someone had actually fed Ivan a lethal fast-acting dose, the way popular legend often imagines, modern toxicology would very likely have caught it, exactly the same way it caught Anastasia's case decades earlier under similar testing. What the physical evidence does clearly support instead is a slower, far more complicated kind of harm. Years of entirely legitimate mercury-based medical treatment, faithfully administered by well-meaning court physicians who had absolutely no idea they were dealing with a cumulative poison, layered on top of a severe, independently documented, degenerative spinal disease that would have caused relentless chronic pain for years on end. Add in a body already weakened by prolonged immobility, chronic stress, and possibly a lifetime of erratic overall health, and a sudden acute event like a stroke or a blood clot. Exactly the kind of instant collapse eyewitnesses described happening in the middle of a casual chess game becomes entirely plausible without invoking any poison at all. That said, careful historians are always cautious never to call this particular case fully closed. Toxicology extracted from bones nearly 400 years old genuinely has real scientific limits. A slower acting poison, or one carefully administered in smaller doses spread out over time, might simply not leave the kind of dramatic chemical signature that a single lethal dose reliably would. The underlying political motive for wanting Ivan dead was undeniably real and well documented, and the remarkably rapid consolidation of power around Boris Godunov remains, at an absolute minimum, a striking historical coincidence worth noting. The most responsible conclusion historians tend to land on today is a genuinely layered one. Ivan's death was very likely accelerated, and quite possibly directly caused, by decades of well-intentioned but slowly poisonous medical treatment combined with severe, untreated underlying illness, while a targeted deliberate assassination, though considerably less supported by the specific surviving toxicology, still can't be entirely ruled out given the real limits of what 400-year-old bones can actually tell us today. In other words, put simply, the doctors may well have been slowly killing him for years without ever meaning to, even if no single assassin ever needed to step in and finish the job themselves. Legacy. Whatever finally stopped his heart that quiet March morning, Ivan's death reshaped the entire course of Russian history almost immediately. His gentle, ill-suited son Fyodor formally took the throne but quietly left the actual business of governing to Boris Godunov, who ruled as the real power standing behind an increasingly symbolic, ceremonial Tsar. When Fyodor himself died in 1598 without an heir of his own, the centuries-old Rurik dynasty, the very same royal line Ivan had inherited as a frightened 3-year-old boy back in 1533, came to a definitive end. Godunov was formally elected Tsar in his place, but his own reign was troubled from the very start, and Russia soon spiraled into the chaotic, deeply violent period historians now simply call the Time of Troubles. A 15-year stretch of devastating famine, brutal civil war, and repeated foreign invasion that very nearly destroyed the entire state Ivan had spent his whole life building. Ivan's own personal legacy has never settled into a simple, tidy verdict, and it probably never fully will. He was, quite genuinely, the ruler who transformed a mid-sized medieval principality into the first true Russian tsardom, roughly doubling its territory, professionalizing its army for the first time, and laying legal and administrative groundwork that would go on to outlast him by centuries. He was also, just as genuinely, a man whose sustained reign of terror against his own nobility killed thousands of his own subjects over the decades, and whose sudden personal violence ultimately claimed the life of his most capable, promising heir. In Russia today, his public statues still generate real, heated public debate wherever they go up. A ruler whose empire building is openly celebrated, even as his brutality is just as openly condemned, sometimes by the very same people, in the very same breath. And at the quiet center of it all remains that one unresolved afternoon back in March of 1584. An old, visibly sick man, a chessboard he never actually got to finish setting up, and a death that modern forensic science has narrowed down considerably without ever fully completely closing the case. Was it disease, steadily worsened by centuries-old medicine that we now know was slowly poisoning him the entire time? Or was there, somewhere inside, that swollen, grieving, deeply paranoid court. One more conspiracy that simply never managed to leave a trace behind? 400 years later, the bones themselves have told us almost everything they possibly can. What they still can't tell us is the one thing everybody watching still really wants to know. So, poison, disease, or the two working together without anyone ever fully intending it? Let us know which theory you personally find more convincing down in the comments below. If you enjoyed uncovering this mystery with us today, make sure you're subscribed, because Clue Series has plenty more unsolved history waiting for you. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next investigation.